Welcome everyone. We are recording today's meeting, and I have posted in the chat box for you where this recording will be posted in about a week's time. So on our PA Care Partnership website, we have a lot of cultural and linguistic competency resources, and specifically have been recording and uploading all of the presentations as a part of our webinar series to the website. So you can go there after today, probably in about a week's time, to download today's presentation if you need to look back on something that you've seen today, or you'd like to share it with others. The recording will be available for accessing there. Additionally, if you are just joining us, we would love if you could type into the chat box your name, what state or county you come from if you're from within Pennsylvania, and your organization or agency or community partnership that you're affiliated with that brings you to today's webinar and to systems of care. So this is the second installment of a three-part webinar series we have planned for 2019 through the Pennsylvania Care Partnership. Our first webinar in the series looked at addressing unconscious bias, and that webinar is actually available on the website I listed as well. And so if you weren't able to attend that session, please feel free to go back and check it out. We encourage you to do so and to use the resource freely and as much as you'd like. We hope that it is something that can be used from now in the future, and something that you can take to your local communities and sort of spread that knowledge. Today, our second installment for the webinar series is on culturally responsive systems of care that often engage the family first. So my name, for those who I haven't met, we've got a great cohort of folks who are on the call with us today, is Kelsey Leonard. This is a picture of me if you haven't had a chance to meet me. I do hope that our paths cross in the future if they haven't already. But I am the Cultural and Linguistic Competence Coordinator, short for that is CLC, for the Pennsylvania Care Partnership. If there's anything today that you are curious about, want more information on, if there's a partnership that we could link up on to further CLC across Pennsylvania, please feel free to email me. That's my email listed there, leonardkt@upmc.edu. So some of our objectives today. First, we want to be able to understand the distinct cultures of families. Second, hopefully we'll be able to examine some strategies for engaging families in systems of care. Discuss experiences of successful individualized supports that embrace family diversity. And what I mean by that is I'm going to present you with some strategies that have worked for us through the PA Care Partnership and others that have worked with counties that we partner with. But I also am going to look to you as those with lived experiences to really share some of your thoughts and best practices related to success and tailorizing supports that embrace family diversity and lead us to being more engaged and having more successful systems of care. But also don't be afraid to share challenges. I think we can commit to co-learning in public through those challenges and really provide for our collective growth by understanding that those challenges are probably shared a lot amongst a lot of our counties, amongst a lot of the organizations that are represented on today's call. After that, we want to also be able to learn about the diversity of family cultural orientation and explore approaches for improving integration of the family culture into your system of care work, which is probably what brought you to today's call. So the first thing, and some of what we talk about today may be familiar to those that have participated on previous sessions of the webinar series, but this question never gets old because it really is informed by those who sign on. And today we definitely have a lot of new folks and folks who haven't previously participated in one of our webinar series. So we start with this question, and feel free to type your answers into the chat box. But we want to brainstorm a little bit. And so for those who are able, What is culture? If you could take a few moments to think about how you might define what culture is and type it into the chat. I have one answer so far: the environment and people around us, shared beliefs, values, or customs and traditions of a people, customs shared by a group, and specifically by a social group. Any other thoughts related to culture? Okay, well, these are really great, and oftentimes that is those are the answers that we come up with. But sometimes we leave a few things off when we think about culture. We're not as broad in our understanding of culture. So generally, the definition of culture that we use within cultural and linguistic competency is it's the set of attitudes, values, beliefs, symbols, and behaviors shared by a group of people, but different for each individual, and is usually communicated from one generation to the next. And I think generally, as you can see from the chat box, many of you had those selections. You thought about values and beliefs, and you identified that it's something that needs to be shared by a group. But one of the things that we often miss in our understanding of culture is the generational component. And so for this generational component, it's to understand that we really do pass on these understandings of attitudes, values, beliefs, symbols from one generation to the next. And when we think about families and the culture of family, that's really integral to how we understand culture and how we understand that generational passage of these understandings. So one of the things I wanted to share with you, and we've done this previously on some of our other webinars, is this idea of cultural groups. So if you could take a moment just to think about what are your cultural groups. When we think about this, it's groups of people who consciously or unconsciously share identifiable values, norms, symbols, and some ways of living that are repeated and transmitted from one generation to another. So this is sort of a definition we might have for cultural groups. So again, if in the chat box and you feel bold enough, if you'd like to share what might be some cultural groups that you identify with, we'd love to hear some of your thoughts. So we've got one college graduate, definitely working mother, social worker, supervisor. For my own, I put Native American, a woman, an advocate, military family, educator, religion, of course. Yes, there may be a specific religious group that you identify with. Mother of teenage boys, definitely. There's a unique culture to that. Afro-Hispanic, social worker, woman, Christian. Married. Marriage is definitely a social institution that brings a lot of cultural understandings with it, definitely. Friend. So we're really starting to see that there is a diversity of cultural groupings that each of us brings with us based on our lived experience. And now think about that in the context of the youth and families that you work with. There are these, just within one individual, there is a diversity of cultural groupings. And then if you think about the family as a whole, or in a holistic fashion as a unit, there will be multiple cultural groupings that may exist within that family, and that family has ties and relationships to. And that really does inform how they see the world, how they understand being healthy, how they understand not being healthy and not feeling well. And so these are things that we need to consider when we're trying to build systems of care that really are family driven. And that's a principle of systems of care that I'll go into further. But before I do that, I want to also highlight that when we think about the different cultural groupings we belong to, a great resource is the cultural iceberg, and trying to understand how culture is much bigger than just race and ethnicity. I think especially in our current society, we often hear the word culture or diversity, and we're just like, and we limit the scope to race and ethnicity. And that isn't to invalidate those two really important cultural groupings and understandings of culture, but we also need to broaden from there and to understand that culture is much more inclusive and representative of every person and human being that walks this planet, in the sense that it really incorporates not only our race and ethnicity, but our behaviors, our language, our actions, our gender, our sexual orientation, our style, our age, our values, the way in which we think about religion and experience religion. And so this cultural iceberg, the neat thing about this image is that there are certain things culturally that sit above the surface, things that people feel or generally are perceived to sit above the surface, might be a better way of saying that, because there are things that when we go out into the world, people feel that they can perceive about us, potentially our race or our gender or the language that we speak. But then there also are a lot of things that aren't readily perceptible, aren't things that unless we engage with people on, they might not be aware of. And this is really important to how we think about engaging families, because generally, prior to systems of care, prior to being family driven, we were only initiating engagement, thinking about partnerships around the things that sit above the surface. And what we need to do through systems of care is actually think about the family and the culture of the family as the entirety of the iceberg, not just those things that are surface level or above the surface. So with that, we also want to provide you with some definitions of cultural competency, because if we think about, core values of systems of care, cultural and linguistic competency being one of those, oftentimes it's a phrasing that's thrown around, but we don't really define it. So from a more organizational understanding, cultural competence is the state of being capable of functioning effectively in the context of cultural differences. When we then sort of think of organizational cultural competence, it's a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals and enable that system, agency, or those professionals to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. Now, the one sort of precaution around cultural competence, or the language of cultural competence, is that we're also starting to see this language evolve. Evolve in the sense that we're not just trying to enable people to be capable of functioning effectively, but we want them to be able to function with cultural humility is a new aspect and phrasing that's coming out of emerging practice, so that people are able to function with cultural humility, where we're able to really welcome cultures that are different from our own, to embrace them, to work effectively, to ensure that we're responsive. So that's another phrasing that's emerging, is cultural responsiveness rather than just competency. So it's not just about being capable of functioning, but also being responsive and really being able to think kind of the old adage of being able to walk a mile in another person's shoes or another family's shoes is really behind the idea of humility and responsiveness, to ensure that we are being youth and family driven and not just trying to sort of fit families and youth into an already existing system. Although one of the key things that often gets forgotten in this work around cultural and linguistic competency is linguistic competence. So I share this definition often in our trainings, that the linguistic competence is the capacity of an organization and its personnel to communicate effectively and convey information in a manner that is easily understood by diverse audiences, including persons of limited English proficiency, those who have low literacy skills or are not literate, and individuals with disabilities. Now, one of the really important aspects of understanding linguistic competency, I think, is captured very well in this definition. Oftentimes, people, in the same way that they think of culture as being only race and ethnicity, will think of linguistic competency only in terms of non-English speakers. And even that is not appropriate, because from what you can see in this definition is it's not just about someone's linguistic background or limited English proficiency, but it's also about literacy levels and ability and individuals with different abilities. So those that may have a literacy level that isn't very fluent in health terminology or mental health terminology or medical terminology, we have to be conscious of that and responsive to that. And doing so is about building up our linguistic competency. Also, those individuals that may have a hearing impairment, a vision impairment, any other type of maybe cognitive ability issues in terms of how we engage in communication and engage in service delivery needs to be responsive to the different literacy and linguistic needs of the communities and youth and families that we're serving. And so with these definitions, we start to really hone in on how do we define cultural competence. And cultural competence involves responding to children and families from all cultures in a way that recognizes and values their uniqueness. This is what we're striving for. We also want to create and develop staff and frontline workers who are culturally competent so that they understand the diverse cultural beliefs, values, and traditions of the families with whom they work. This involves an awareness of how the family culture influences their behavior and how their view of the current situation is informed by their cultural backgrounds. Culturally competent workers practice interventions that respond to the specific cultural needs and experiences of their clients. You can replace that with a different term depending on the type of work that you do. And historically, it also is about linking to the historic issues, the systemic issues that have made it so that we haven't been as culturally responsive as we should be in the delivery of care. Historically, services to children and families have been selected from a limited set of choices that do not consider families' cultures, values, or their experiences. So really, with that, it's this history of saying, oh, we have a cookie cutter mechanism and menu of services that is available to families, and there's no deviation from that menu or from that cookie cutter experience. And we need to recognize that one size does not fit all, and that if we are creating programs and policies that sit within a monoculture or really are only designed with one culture in mind, we are doing a disservice to families because we're not taking into consideration the breadth of cultures and diversity of cultures that might exist within the communities that we're serving. Lastly, it's about using interventions that address a family's cultural values and traditions and which will increase their likelihood of positive outcomes. So there have been studies done, there is evidence to show that the more tailored our interventions and services are to family cultural values, the increased likelihood of positive outcomes for the youth and family being served. So this really is evidence-based in how we should be approaching this work. So family culture, it's a phrase that we're going to be seeing a lot throughout today's presentation, but what do we really mean when we say it? Well, a family's culture influences their behavior and their responses to the behavior of others, especially when two cultures or two individuals or a family and an individual of differing cultural understandings, cultural groupings are coming into contact with one another. That's when we can sort of have these cultural bumps or cultural hiccups occur. If we're not conscious that there's a difference, that there is a diversity of cultural experiences that are coming to the forefront to try and mobilize together to understand what needs to happen for the delivery of care. And the way that happens is we just go in with maybe an unconscious bias or a preconceived understanding that we're all the same. And in a lot of ways, we're not. And there's a beauty in that, and there's an ability to see sustainable change. And I think sort of Wise System of Care values cultural and linguistic competency so fervently, and family voices and being family driven, because it embraces this ideology of we're not all the same, and that's amazing. And that's the reason for us to have more successes, if we do truly embrace that understanding. So understanding that the family's culture influences their behaviors and their responses to the behaviors of others, this suggests that a family's cultural experiences can have an impact on practice at all levels. Culture shapes the way that individuals view their problems and the ways in which they respond to interventions. So a family's culture can affect the type of services needed, as well as the way in which these services are provided. So the way that culture influences families, attitudes, beliefs, customs, traditions, clothing, food, language, achievements, how we understand achievements too as well when we think about mental and behavioral health care and wanting to move youth and families towards positive outcomes. The way those outcomes are recognized, understood, how achievements are celebrated may be different based on the family's culture. And recognizing that and trying to learn what those unique cultural attributes are will be important to achieving positive outcomes. So for those of you who may be joining the call today and aren't familiar with systems of care, I just wanted to provide you with some general background. Now, systems of care can be and have been adapted locally at different states and county levels, and so the perspectives may vary a bit, but generally systems of care is first and foremost a set of values and principles that provides an organizing framework for systems reform on behalf of children, youth, and families. So more specifically, it's an approach to service delivery that is family-focused, community-based, and culturally competent. The focus is to build partnerships that create a network of services tailored to meet the individual needs of children and families. And so I want to highlight that here. Hopefully you leave today, and if you don't, we're going to have a period towards the end of the presentation. So if you don't feel like you've left today understanding how to build partnerships, please bring that up in sort of the Q&A and the discussion portion of today's webinar, because we can really learn from each other and learn from our shared successes and challenges as to how to move forward. But I want to highlight that today's webinar is not just about building knowledge on systems of care and family engagement and what we mean by the culture of the family. That's really important, because you can't know where you're going until you know where you've been. And having that sort of defining space is great, but it's also about action. Systems of care is about change, and so when we think about engaging families, it is centered around building partnerships, and we really do need to hopefully leave here today with personal, individualized, as well as maybe organizational commitments about how we're building partnerships with families. And if I ask you the question, what are your existing partnerships with families, and you really don't have any concrete examples to provide, then that's your first place to start, is to work on building authentic partnerships. Systems of care, it also involves a system of services working together toward common goals. And then services involve formal and informal supports that are community-based and match to the specific needs of families. And I think that that's really important, that we really tailor what the programs and the policies that we're developing to be community-based and to be family and community-driven. And we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be family-driven versus having a sort of a family-focused approach, or integrating family voice isn't necessarily the same as being family-driven. And so these are important distinctions to note in how we build authentic partnerships. This is a more, the word coming to mind is clinical definition, but maybe a more strict definition of systems of care, but I wanted to provide it for you so that you sort of have this to think about. But some core values of systems of care, that it be youth and family driven, community-based, and culturally and linguistically competent. So we're trying to think about today, how do we integrate all of these core values to frame the ways in which we engage families. So some core principles for family support. Staff and families work together in relationships based on equality and respect. Staff enhances families' capacity to support the growth and development of all family members. So these should be principles that we are enacting through systems of care. Maybe we're doing really well in some of them, and maybe there's areas that we could work on and improve upon. And so you really could use some of these principles to even create an assessment, some focus groups with staff. You could have a staff discussion about these principles to say, you know, are we really doing this? Are we living up to these principles? Should we be adapting these principles to be more relevant to our communities and the people that we're serving? But they are really generally great principles for supporting families. So continuing, families are resources to their own members, other families, programs, and communities. So really valuing families as a resource and compensating them for the time and consultation that they provide. System of care programs affirm and strengthen families' cultural, racial, and linguistic identities. So again, we are not focused, and we shouldn't be focused on fitting families into a monoculture or one size fits all, but embracing the diversity that exists across families. System of care programs are embedded in their communities and contribute to community building. So to do that, you also need to have community partnerships that are valued by families, that are representative of the family's cultural background. So, for example, you may be serving a predominantly African American community, but if all of your partnerships exist, the partnerships that you have with community organizations aren't representative of any of the community organizations that predominantly serve the African American community, then you're missing something. There's a disconnect that's occurring there, and the family may not feel, families, predominantly African American families that are seeking services, may not feel that they're fully represented in the systems. And feel that their voice or their perspective, their cultural understandings are not being valued. So it's important to make sure that the communities that you're working with and the community partnerships that you're building are actually reflective of the people you're serving. System of care programs also advocate with families for services and systems that are fair, responsive, and accountable to the families served. Practitioners work with families to mobilize formal and informal resources to support family development. Programs are flexible and responsive to emerging family and community issues. And lastly, principles of family support are modeled in all program activities. So I think what's really important there is that system of care is not about creating silos, and it's hopefully about actually breaking down our existing silos of sort of systems operating, you know, in isolation, not really communicating with one another. So a big part of system of care principles as it pertains to families is we don't want to create new silos that kind of relegate families to their own little corner of program activities, and they're not connected to the other system of care program activities that may be happening. Unfortunately, that does happen, and so that's something that we have to be cautious of. Sometimes we're so focused on uplifting families, making sure that they're a part of decision making, you know, making sure that there's agency and authority and their ability to act within the system of care, that in the process of doing so, we create some new type of family voice entity that then sits outside of everyone else who's making decisions and everyone else who's having conversations. And that doesn't help. That actually just winds up siloing family voice and family ideas into its own space where they're still not being heard at an equitable level. So what does this look like in terms of what are we asking for when we think about family engagement and system of care? Well, we're asking for practice shifts. So if you've taken on system of care, you're probably working towards shifting from what previously may have occurred in terms of blaming the families for issues that were occurring to we want to move towards family partnerships, really valuing the family and valuing their lived experience to champion a partnership that allows for growth and development. There's this we also want to shift from this sort of accepted power imbalance, that the family is not seen as having authority or power over their circumstance, to an acknowledgement of this power imbalance, excuse me, and then working with the family and their fears and concern, and validating that their fears and concerns are real. So it's not just ignoring the power imbalance, but it's acknowledging it, and then it's working to empower the family based on their fears and concerns of that imbalance. We also are shifting from there being sort of this multiple service plans for a child or youth to trying to have a single plan, and really having the plan for delivery of care be family driven, right? They are part of the process. Again, and we're shifting lastly from this sort of idea of having a monoculture, whether that was unconsciously done or consciously done. We have shown that historically within mental and behavioral health, we've designed programs and interventions that are predominantly driven from a Euro-American Western perspective. That does not account for other cultures, for other understandings, and we need to be more flexible. We need to be more sensitive to the diversity of families that exist in our country and in the world now. So these are the shifts that we're striving for when we think about family engagement through systems of care. Here are just some more examples of the shifts in roles and expectations. So before, it was families were just to be recipients of information. They were given these requirements. They didn't really have, their voices weren't really heard. They were receiving these services and supports, sometimes even services and supports that they didn't want or need, or weren't adapted to their unique backgrounds. They often weren't invited to key stakeholder meetings, discussions, training initiatives. And this really created this sort of conflict between systems and families, where there was anger and adversity and resistance. And that's something that we're really trying to move away from. And I know that in a lot of instances, it still exists, and it's still very prevalent in our systems. But if we really are committed to systems of care, we're trying to shift away from that. And sort of the middle range column there is kind of showing you sort of how to enable those shifts, that hopefully we get to sort of the other end of the spectrum, where service and supports, where families are really supporting the plans. They're leading the plans that are being developed. They're partners in developing and conducting program evaluations. They are being linked with services and supports through providers, and are really driving the types of services and supports that they're receiving. And that the systems advocacy and peer support is really much stronger through systems of care, once the shift has occurred, than it previously was. And so we don't have this high level of anger and adversity and resistance, at least is the hope, if we do our work right. So again, just kind of honing in a bit more on what we're thinking about here. Families and system of care, it's about permanency is best facilitated when the family is actively involved in planning and participating in services. Involving family members in the planning process emphasizes their role as a part of the solution, and not necessarily a problem, right? So that's a big shift, and I think an important note to recognize is we're shifting from the previous potential and experience of some families where they were blamed and they were seen as being the part of the problem and not the solution. And we want to shift that to say, your culture, your unique family identity brings value to this process, and we want to use it to support the co-developed solutions for a path forward. Engaging families also helps to ensure sensitivity to their culture and values, and families can be involved as key stakeholders in all aspects of decision-making and service delivery. So how that potentially could occur: families are considered the most important resource and are viewed as the experts concerning their children or youth's lives. As a result, feedback is actively sought from the families, and families is much broader than just parents. It can include extended family, caregivers, and additional kin, and sort of how the cultural background of a family and the cultural groupings of a family can initiate that understanding of who is kin. And that's a common question that you will hear among a diverse background of families. They may often recognize each other based on unique understandings of kin. So this is where I wanted to highlight. Previously, I had mentioned that there's a difference with what we mean by family-driven and family voice. So, and this is kind of previously within systems of care, I think we started to saying, oh, we want to be family-centered. And family-centered care articulates families should share in decision-making. And then we sort of shifted to say, well, that's not really what we are striving for. We started to say, well, we want to have family voice. And family voice and choice asserts families' preferences should guide care. And then we said, well, no, that's not really enough either. And we sort of shifted to this new role of the family, which is to say that we need to be family-driven. And family-driven expands on the family's role to include both the individual and policy level and allows for informed decision-making. So families really get to be as active as they want to be in the process and in the systems, as it kind of imagining this new space where before it was just sort of relegated that the family role was just situated within their individual family. But we actually are starting to realize that families have so much to offer. They are such a valuable resource if we really want to create systems change, that they should be able to affect change at the policy level if they want to. And so that's what family-driven is also about. It's expanding. It's not sort of doing away with being family-centered or having family voice, but it's expanding on those two principles to say, but we can also and should be striving for being family-driven. So when we think about now, you might be saying to yourself, okay, I kind of understand the trajectory of valuing families, why we should be doing this, why this is a principle of system of care, how it relates, how cultural and linguistic competency of the culture of the family relates to this work. But how do I go about identifying family culture? And all I can say to you is it's actually going to be, it needs to be context specific, and it's going to be unique to each of your organizations and agencies and the youth and families that you're working with. But I did put forward a few questions that I thought would be very helpful for you to take back to your organizations and agencies to ask yourselves, to maybe think about when we get to the Q&A portion of today. But firstly, it's how does your organization's intake process interface with the needs of diverse families? So in the process of the intake process, do you ask questions about culture, about family culture? Do you ask questions that could help you to better understand the culture of the family based on everything that we've already just discussed? If not, then maybe there's some aspects of the intake process that could be revised to better help you to account for the diversity of families. I know that in certain programs, you do kind of do the sort of a cultural worksheet with families for intakes, but the level of engagement and training about how to do those cultural worksheets is sporadic and not necessarily standardized. So it's a bit of, do you have a process? How do you conduct intakes? Are they familiar with the culture of families? Do they ask these questions? And is the way in which the questions are asked and the answers are solicited, are they effective? So there's a bit of quality improvement and evaluation that should be happening, and not just a given that, oh, well, we have a worksheet, so we know the cultures of families. The next sort of level to that is, okay, well, you have a process. Is the process effective? And so doing some type of assessment with that is really helpful. The next question I have for you to ask yourselves and your organizations is, do you tailor services? So I talked a lot about cookie cutterness and monoculture. How are you tailoring services to the unique cultures of the families that you're working with, if at all? And if not, how could you work to do that? What are some of those maybe institutional or structural barriers you'd have to overcome to be able to tailor services? And then lastly, is there an established protocol for working with families from various cultural backgrounds? So again, this gets to this idea of recognizing that there's not a monoculture. So do you have trainings, pamphlets, guidelines, policy memos available for staff about military families that they may be working with, the uniqueness of rural families that they may be working with, or the uniqueness of the African American, Hispanic, or Asian communities, Latinx communities that might be present in the communities and counties that you are working with. That's really important. And also to recognize that there's not sort of one monolith of African American culture. You really are going to have to tailor it to the African American communities or the specific Hispanic communities that are in the counties that you're working in. So a part of that, if you can go through those questions and have really concrete answers to those questions, or work towards having concrete answers to those questions, then you can start.
Kelsey, I think we lost you for a second. Are you still there? Everyone can just
That's a key shift that we're advocating for. It's also important to convey that family members' active involvement is wanted, needed, and valued throughout the process. And that might be something that you have to have really courageous conversations with your leadership members prior to bringing on family members, if they aren't currently there, that they're not tokenized, family members aren't tokenized, that they actually really are valued and wanted and needed. And if people can't get on board with that, then maybe the collaborative sort of decision-making systems of care process is not something that they're ready for, and or you can be looking sort of for others who really want to commit to commit to the system of care principles. So supporting families. What is the family's view of the problem? So again, when we think about how do we, at the individual level, previous slides were a bit more at the policy level, but at the individual level, how do we support families? We want to look at what does the family need? What is the overall scope of support necessary for the situation that maybe you're coming into contact with them around? What services does your organization agency have to support this need? What challenges or opportunities does the family's culture pose towards service delivery, and what other resources could integrate towards this need? So again, these are things that you should have answers to if you really are embracing family diversity and trying to engage families of diverse cultural backgrounds. And if you're not asking these questions, maybe these are questions that you can build into a worksheet, to an assessment tool, to a debrief form that you have with staff. There's a lot of ways that you could individualize these supports to the families that you're working with. Again, some additional strategies for effective engagement of families, sort of at the more broader organizational level, is to demonstrate to the family that you are interested in their culture and that their culture is an important element in the process. Acknowledge families as experts. Acknowledge the importance of extended family. This is especially important around grandparents and other people that may live in the home. When we're trying to shift away from that monoculture, a big history of the monoculture model has been sort of this idea of the nuclear family, sort of, mom, dad, and 2 kids. We are definitely shifting away from that for so many reasons, because it's not representative of the families we have in the world today. And really, it's never really been representative of the families that existed in the world. And so we need to shift from that, to recognize that, and to embrace a more extended, fluid, and flexible model. A part of that is learning based on the culture of the family, who they consider to be family. It's not the same for everyone. Determine also how the phrasing here is acculturated the family is to their current environment. And so what we mean by that is um, it's important to know whether the family is new to the county, new to the community, new to their environment, whatever environment that may be. How comfortable do they feel with this new space and places that they're existing in? Or maybe they might be old spaces that they're spaces and places that they're existing in. But acculturation and alignment with the other sort of cultural groupings and social groupings that exist within the community is important to understanding how to ensure positive outcomes. And then also the power differential. Remember, we said that we're trying to shift from this sort of just accepted notion of a power imbalance to really acknowledging the power imbalance and then trying to work to eliminate some of the fears and concerns that families may have. And we have to do that by remembering that we hold positions of power often as members or agents of organizations, agencies, and systems. So some strategies, like how do you take these sort of like broad overarching principles and implement them at sort of the organizational level? Again, it's to consider how new families are welcomed by your organization or agency. You could be developing written policies, procedures, newsletters, and languages that reflect the community. You could provide family training workshops for effective systems communication strategies and how to do partnerships. You could create a consultation policy for family involvement that values their time and expertise equally to the others involved in systems of care. And so what I mean by that consultation policy is also sort of a compensation consultation policy, so that when we say you're valuing their expertise and their time, if the way in which you value that is a monetary compensation for others, then that also needs to be extended to families. Support ongoing training for families to provide family leadership on county leadership teams and state and federal program advisory committees, community advisory groups, etc. You could create a mentoring program. You could partner with families to create trainings on various cultures. So that's one that I think is really special and could be tailored to each of your counties. You may have a really large population of families who you're serving that come from a coal mining backgrounds or iron workers, or there's some type of economic connection, or maybe there's a geography connection or a religious connection that is really prevalent in the families, in the cultural backgrounds of the families that you're serving. And so it might be really great to have trainings on those specific cultures that are unique to your county. And how they're impacting sort of mental and behavioral health and the way that we think about health, and the way that we also plan for positive outcomes. Also, you can and should celebrate diversity and family participation with recognition events, and it's a great way to involve the community, to establish community partnerships, to celebrate diverse foods that you may not be familiar with. And I'm sure that you probably have examples of effective strategies that you could share with us later during our discussion. So if you're thinking about that now, feel free to write some down of things that you think have worked really well in your organization, agency, home community, in terms of how families have been properly engaged. You can also share challenges if you think that there have been some attempts that weren't as successful. At the PA Care Partnership, here are some of the things that we've really worked on. So family cafes. So we've had a few counties that have hosted what are community cafes, but they're designed to be sort of family driven and really highlight the family voice. So you can really, it's just bringing together for food and fellowship and conversation and being able to sort of create that peer network, that peer mentorship very organically through these community gatherings. It also has been through formal leadership roles, so making sure that there are formal leadership roles for family members. Trainings, some trainings that are exclusive to family members, some training, and then also just making sure that family members are invited to all trainings and also have the funding to attend trainings, right? And I've seen some really creative ways in some counties where there will be scholarship funds or competitions or lotteries for family members to be able to attend conferences or workshops throughout the year to help them grow professionally, as well as in their advocacy and in their understandings, for not only advocating for their own family, but for other families. Consultation compensation policies, I mentioned that earlier. You might know them as stipend policies, but that's different. I think stipends generally have been sort of menial in the type of compensation that's provided. When we think about consultation compensation policies within the PA Care Partnership, it's really about that equity provision and saying that we're valuing everyone's time and resource and expertise equally. Community events are great ways to engage families, especially if you partner with existing community organizations that families often go to, but maybe don't have a lot of experience understanding your organization or your agency. So you set up a booth, you have an informational table. It's really helpful to get families to engage by going where they are and where they're comfortable. I would also encourage you to have faith-based partnerships. There are really great ways to partner with churches, with mosques, with synagogues, with non-denominational organizations, to think about those sort of faith-based partnerships. And then also there are family organizations. If you don't, some of you may have a family organization that you've created that you want to continue to uplift and support. Maybe you want to create one. They're just really great resources, and there are national family organizations that you can be a part of as a chapter. So you could formulate local chapters in your county or in your area. So these are just some examples that we have from the PA Care Partnership about ways that we've been trying to value the unique cultures of families and then support them in our system of care work. So ultimately, this is about understanding that entering a family's home is also entering a sacred place. So when we think about culture and diversity and different cultural groupings, the home is kind of the epicenter of where the intergenerational knowledge is shared. And because of that, it's a very sacred place that we need to be more respectful of. Understand that that what we are teaching or assisting a family with must be complementary to the culture for it to work. So we really need to start adapting our services, our trainings, everything to the communities that we're serving and we're trying to educate. And then and also recognize that they can educate us probably a whole lot more than we can educate them. And so having those authentic partnerships where we can enable co-learning opportunities, co-knowledge mobilization is really key to getting some sustainable change that's based in equity. And then lastly, understanding that the family has strengths and systems of care principles promote system partners working to enhance those strengths. Again, not seeing the family as the source of all the problems, but really recognizing that there are strengths that exist there, even if there are problems. Most often, if there are problems, there are strengths, and that we should be focusing in on how those strengths can lead us to positive outcomes. So going forward, in order to provide culturally competent practice, interventions must be used that recognize and respond to cultural values, traditions, and experiences of families. But this whole process and even this webinar series and the way in which we engage and work at the PA Care Partnership is ongoing. There isn't a checklist that I can give you, and I'm sorry if maybe you came into the webinar feeling like I was going to give you a checklist of here's what you need to do to adequately engage families. But that's not how this works. You really do have to continually build your competency. Cultural competence, it implies the ability to take action, adapt, and function in different environments. And that's a key part of this. There's no checklist because each of you comes from a different environment. You come from different communities. You come from different experiences of engaging families. And so my checklist, if there is one, it's to understand that this is an ongoing process. But to take action, even if it's little action, there's really no such thing as too little action, but some type of action. Really think about how you can be more adaptive and flexible in how you're connecting with families and delivering. And then just be committed to the fact that it is this developmental process. that it's going to take time. There will be some things that you can do maybe overnight, and then there are some things that will take years. And so but the thing is, that's okay, and it's good to plan. We encourage people to create CLC plans. Hopefully, you could have a CLC plan that has a whole section just on family engagement that are very helpful in realizing that. And that really, cultural and linguistic competency, these are elements that need to be integrated into all aspects of our programs, policies, and services. They're just not a separate component. So we're trying to change how we make decisions to include families, to have them actually be decision makers. We want to make a commitment to structural and policy changes that support the cultural diversity of families. And we also want to make sure that the policies and practices that we have are fluid, that we don't sort of embrace the monoculture. We embrace diversity. We embrace sort of the pluralism, the plurality of cultures that exist in all different parts of the world today. So just leaving you with a few key ideas before we go into sort of the Q&A, any questions you might have for me. I have a few questions for you. If we think about how do we move forward, we're changing our attitudes, we're changing policies, and practices must become more congruent with the cultures of the families that we're serving. And so ultimately, culture matters. When culture is ignored, families are at risk of not getting the support that they need, or worse yet, receiving assistance that is more harmful than helpful. So we have a bit of time. The webinars usually go for an hour and a half. We'd like to connect with you. If there are things that you've heard today that were really helpful, things that you'd still like to know, we encourage you to type them into the chat box. We also may unmute lines. Just be cautious that you should mute yourself if you don't want us to hear you. But we can unmute the lines if people would like to add to the conversation. I know we have quite a few family members on the call today. So my overarching question, for you, if you don't have any for us, is what have been some successful strategies you've seen for engaging families in systems of care that is responsive to their culture?
Yeah, and just this is Mark. Thank you, Kelsey. And just so everyone's aware, I did unmute the lines. I think you'll still have to on your end. Just you might have to hit unmute. A little yellow bar may have popped up if you want to unmute.
You're also welcome to tell us about challenges that you face. I know that we have quite a few people on the line who are from Pennsylvania, from some of our partner system of care counties. If you think that there are challenges, and this is okay to be a vent session, but if there are challenges you've seen in terms of culture of the family not being respected, not being honored, ways in which that the culture of the family hasn't been successfully integrated for engaging families, or that you feel that people don't really understand what the culture of the family means, you can share some of those challenges or struggles with us as well, and we can try and collectively talk about them. Okay, so we have a response. We ask our staff to note some cultural preferences that families may have. Any suggestions on how to ask families about their culture, cultural preferences? We have some things in place, but wanted to see if you have any other suggestions. That's great. And others on the line, if you have any suggestions about how to ask about culture and you want to sort of type in your thoughts or responses or add them through, like you can talk about them on the phone, you can unmute your lines and feel free to discuss that. Some ideas that I might have about asking about cultural preferences. Well, my first thing I would say is see if there are some youth and family partners, some youth and family members that you've worked with or in the community that you could partner with to develop these questions. Or maybe you have a draft. It sounds like you do have maybe some sort of already existing policy or process about how cultural preferences are asked with families. I would share those, see if you could get kind of a little advisory working group together. I would share those with that working group, and hopefully it's made up of youth and families, and get their feedback, because they're going to have some really targeted ideas that are local to where you're working, and they would probably have the best insight as to how to in an appropriate manner and in a way that really hones in on the uniqueness of your specific county. One of the things I would also recommend there as well, in terms of how to ask families about their culture or cultural preferences, is to provide some background as to why you're asking the questions. Sometimes families aren't sure why data is being collected or why questions are being asked, and they're not sure how you're going to use that information. And so historically, there have been instances where that's occurred and the information collected has been used against families, or used against their sort of cultural groupings. So if we think about sort of historical traumas, that can make people hesitant to respond to questions. So I always recommend, in terms of doing some type of cultural preference workup or cultural, background worksheet, that you sort of start a conversation with families of, we are trying to make sure that the services or the plan that we're developing is tailored to you, is a match for your unique family. And in doing so, we're thinking about, trying to understand, who in the home do you consider to be family, or who outside the home do you consider to be family? Do you have any, are there certain times of the day where you have certain cultural obligations or things that you do? So there's, you might even want to break it up into sort of these different categories of food and language and attitudes, beliefs, the timing of the day, how they, you could have a question about, how do you usually resolve conflicts in your family? Is it, silent treatment, or do people kind of go into an all-out shouting match? And for some, that's actually an accepted way of resolving conflict based on their cultural understandings. But that might be very different for the person who has been sent to work with that family or youth. So again, I would just say, to recap, the types of questions you ask need to be tailored to the family, and there's no other better group to sort of frame or help you to frame those questions than families and youth themselves. So putting together some type of small advisory group to assess that, maybe on an annual basis, I think would be really helpful. And then just, really trying to build that rapport, having some type of introductory conversations with youth and families prior to doing any type of cultural worksheet or cultural preference workup, that they understand why you're asking these questions. And then it's really more of a conversation so that you can better understand them than you trying to take information from them. Next question we had was, we find it challenging to find interpreters for some languages. Yes, and that's becoming an even more prevalent issue, given that we're starting to see, especially sort of with those that may have previously been identified as sort of a part of the, I guess people might see them as being Hispanic or something, but we're actually having a lot of indigenous populations from sort of Central America, South America, coming to the U.S. And so and people sort of again, we think it's this thing at the sort of above the surface of the iceberg. They look at those populations and they say, oh, they must be Spanish-speaking populations. Again, which is also like a misnaming, because there's multiple dialects within the Spanish language, so even that is problematic. But it's a misplacement, because they often, those individuals, if they're coming from indigenous populations within those parts of the world, they may not have Spanish as their first or second language, or even any language. They actually are speaking their indigenous languages. So we've seen instances, especially sort of in Pennsylvania and Ohio, with there being a lot more like Quechua, Mayan languages that are becoming prevalent. What I can say in terms of if you're having difficulty for interpreters, the courts, so the courts often have listings of interpreters that are licensed. That's the other thing too. You can run into legal issues, especially around mental and behavioral health or healthcare generally, if you are using an unlicensed interpreter. Don't ever use a family member to interpret for you if it's that's not okay. So we do have to find interpreters. The courts often have a listing of licensed interpreters who you could turn to. So going to the justice system and sort of asking them for interpreter resources. If there's a specific language that you're looking for and you are based in Pennsylvania, you can always reach out to me for direct help on assisting you with finding interpreters. We had an instance of that with a specific aspect of Haitian Creole, patois language, in sort of the middle portion of the state, which was a community that we were working with. And they weren't able to find an interpreter. I was able to find a church, a Haitian church that was relatively close being, not right down the road, but within sort of the middle of the state. And that Haitian church, through reaching out to them, they were able to notify us of someone who has is a licensed interpreter for that specific language. And so there's nuanced ways of finding licensed interpreters. There's also national lists, and others may have examples for you. But if it's a specific language, feel free to reach out to me. The other thing is I would just say to start building a resource list if you don't have one already in existence. Those are really important. Next question. Has anyone had success with getting buy-in from the players in the juvenile justice system related to the importance of family feedback when it comes to influencing policy and decisions that impact them, families? I will let people think about that one. And then, I believe there is an increased awareness in juvenile justice regarding the importance of family engagement as part of the supervision process. Meaningful change doesn't usually happen when you only work with the young person as an individual. But I don't see much value for acknowledging families as partners in the system.
This is Mark. I think that we're slowly seeing some change, especially as we have more and more counties that are from a county leadership perspective, having youth and family members at those decision-making tables to kind of understand and in time really look at those family members and youth as equals in this decision-making. So I think that's one of the aspects of system of care is you start to find the build the trust in those conversations when you're having them with family members. And I think as far as policy and things, I think of Montgomery County. I don't know if we have anybody from Montgomery on the call, but I know they had really done some excellent work through some of their previous system of care work, to the point of having family members and I want to say youth as well, even reviewing and giving input into contracts and policies with programs that the county was going to be working with to make sure that as they were reading it, that they could see that there was family perspectives in the work. But I'll be open here. I come from juvenile justice in York County, so I definitely know kind of that feeling of trying to figure out a good way to change some of the system and really acknowledging that families can be absolute partners in the decision making. I think that as we become more aware through various trainings, both in culture and trauma, and just really understanding our community better, I think in a way there's also a natural change in how we're doing things, to really understand that without having the family, the grandparents, and really what the family also considers family, not just what maybe a system or a legal family is. As people really start to understand and see that more, I do have that belief, and I think we've seen it, that systems are definitely more open to that.
Is there anyone else on the line that has any thoughts around this question around how to have families have greater decision making in juvenile justice, influencing policy and decisions? Well, I can say that I think it's definitely raised a really important aspect of maybe a follow-up conversation related to today's topic. And so maybe that's something that we can explore at the PA Care Partnership about how to look at juvenile justice and aspects of cultural and linguistic competency and the family more broadly, and maybe have that as a future training opportunity. So I thank you for raising that question, for everyone for raising the questions and participating in the comments that you have so far. Just allowing space for anyone else that would like to ask a question either in the chat box or by unmuting your line, or if you have a comment about today's webinar. We have a few more minutes. We're able to take questions or comments.
You know what? This is Mark. I could probably also get one of our new plugs in. So we're working, which really relates directly to that kind of more of that family question and policy. So we're working with the Allegheny Family Network, who just got a new statewide system of care grant. It's called the Pennsylvania Family Alliance for Children's Services. So they're actually going to be hiring about 5 family members as parent or family member outreach to work in the different regions of the state. And they're going to be kind of trained family members that will help to kind of engage and locate maybe some resources, or if not, organizations or family organizations in the different regions and counties that may also be that additional resource that you can kind of look at to say that there is things out there that can really help address some of what we're looking for, and we have good, strong family members that can provide us good input. I think sometimes you have to give the kind of show everybody kind of what it is and what you're thinking about, with all the some of the solutions right there. So, but as we get more information, we'll share that as well. Actually, maybe coming out in an email today.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Did we have any other announcements, Mark? I think there might have been one more, but I'm
Oh, we have our mental health awareness month. So we're having 2 events in May. We have one on May 6th, which will be at the Capitol Rotunda here at the state, and that is at 2:30 to 3:30. So we'll have some speakers. The Secretary of Secretary of Health, Teresa Miller, will be talking. We're hoping the governor will also have a family member and youth, really talking about stigma and kind of overcoming that. And then on May 8th, here in Harrisburg, we're going to have from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., we're going to have a wellness and health fair right here at Strawberry Square at the Commonwealth Towers, which is right across from the Whitaker Center here downtown Harrisburg. And then again, I think Kelsey had shared the link to our website, and I'll put the website back up to capture the webinar that we'll have up in a day or two. Of this webinar, but also when you go on there, if you look under the county and systems area, you'll actually see our county collaborative webinars. So we have actually had a great one yesterday that some people on the call here today actually attended, and that was on some of the work that Crawford County in Western PA was doing related to trauma and ACEs and kind of their journey to kind of get where they are, which gave some real solid examples. So we're going to get that up in a day or two as soon as we get the PowerPoint up and ready to go. And then on there you'll actually find a variety of different webinars that we've done that can also help with some additional education. So, and then if you're looking for system of care information, if you look under resources, there's a good array of information, including family engagement pieces on there as well. And then we also have some family engagement staff that are true experts in this that we can always help out with.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing all those announcements. So what we just want to leave you with, everyone, is a key sort of anecdote quote that we have on cultural competence and linguistic competence are life's journeys, not a destination. So we wish you safe travels, and in those travels, we hope it brings you back to us in May for our last and final webinar of our 2019 webinar series. That will be on May 22nd, I believe, but we'll be sending out a reminder. So if you found today's webinar, then you'll find that one as well. Feel free to register through the survey link that will also send you for that, as you did for today. And yes, please share the content. If you have any questions, I'm happy to be a resource. So please email me, Kelsey Leonard. It's leonardkt@upmc.edu. And again, yeah, if there's a partnership we can link up with you on, if there's resources we can help you to think about developing, we're always looking for opportunities for collaboration. So thank you again to everyone for participating today, and we wish you a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Have a fantastic day.